Good morning or good afternoon. Maybe it's even evening where you are. Welcome back to day 4 of Streaming Media Connect. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, editor-in-chief and VP of Streaming Media and the program chair for Streaming Media Connect. We appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us. And we will be having 2 more panels today. We've had a whole week full of panels covering everything from technical topics like encoding and ATSC 3.0 and advertising technology to business and strategy focused topics like live streaming and sports streaming. And we're going to wrap things up later on today with a forward-looking panel trying to predict what OTT might look like in 5 years. Next week, we have a series of deep dive workshops presented by streaming media contributing editors like Jan Ozer and Robert Reinhardt and Sean Lamb, as well as workshops from some of the industry's leading technology providers. So if you haven't signed up for those and you're interested, you won't regret it. You can go to the Streaming Media Connect website and sign up for those right up until before the workshop begins. So we hope to see some of you there. Before we jump into the panel discussion this morning, though, I'd like to thank our diamond sponsor, Limelight Networks, who've sponsored all the panels this week. And I would also like to thank the sponsor of this session, Harmonic. And Harmonic's Rob Gambino will be one of the speakers joining us to talk about fast channels. We've seen it before. The industry pivots at least once a year. And in the last year, I think it's pivoted 4 or 5 times. And when it pivots, everyone jumps in to fill in the gaps. It seems like the latest pivot is free ad-supported streaming television channels, fast channels like Pluto, Tubi, Xumo, and Stir, and the list goes on. Is there really room for all of these offerings when the dust settles? Who's doing it right? Who's not getting it right? Will this window of opportunity close? Those are the kinds of topics we're going to be discussing in the next hour or so. Our moderator, Jonathan Barbato from Best Ever Channels, was unable to make it this morning, so I am happily stepping in. And with that, I would like to ask our panelists to introduce yourselves, talk about what your company's current involvement or role in the fast channel ecosystem is. And I'm going to start going around the horn, starting in the upper left on my screen, which is Chris Yates from Redbox, who is on mute.
Unmute. So thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm the GM of Redbox's on-demand business. We launched actually around 12 months ago today our fast channel platform. We call it Free Live TV. We have currently 93 channels live on the Free Live TV platform. It's growing really fast over the last 12 months. We've also added just recently an ad-supported on-demand business, free movies on demand, to complement the Free Live TV service.
All right, next up is Rob Gambino from Harmonic.
Thanks, Eric. So Rob Gambino, I'm Director of Solutions at Harmonic. Specifically, I manage our channel origination and delivery platform, which is the most relevant of our products to FAST. Specifically in this space, we do the technology for end-to-end video workflows. So that's everything that touches video from source to screen. And we are delivering to every popular FAST platform today.
All right, thanks. Next up is Nick from Sony. Nick.
Thanks, Eric. Yes, Nick Colsey, VP of Business Development for Sony Electronics. So in that capacity, I look after the curation and promotion of the apps on our smart TVs. You know, from the beginning, really, we've been very positive about the free offerings, you know, going back 12, 13 years. And these days, you know, that means Pluto, Xumo, Tubi, Redbox, of course, Haystack, and many others.
All right, thanks. And last but not least, Andrew Tint from Dish.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Tint. I lead up Sling TV's programmatic partnerships team. Sling is makes up 1/3 of the live OTT ecosystem, but in response to COVID, we did release a free offering with our Stay In and Sling campaign, and I've been slowly working into the AVOD FAST environment to compete and work with folks like Pluto, Tubi, Redbox, etc.
Terrific. Let's start at a high level. I think we can all agree that in the last year, partially as a result of COVID, ad-supported streaming has really taken off, probably quicker than we expected it to. Is it because of COVID? Why do you think that ad-supported streaming and fast channels have really taken off in the last 6 to 12 months? I don't really have specific panelists in mind for answering each question, but Andrew, Chris, you said you launched your fast channel in the last year, so maybe you're a good person to start with that one.
Happy to. Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting forces that are driving uptake of streaming services. I think obviously the pandemic has driven people who perhaps either weren't streaming content as significantly as they were, or those that are but weren't doing it at the same scale that they are today, to really increase the amount of streaming activity that they were doing and that they've been doing. And I think secondly, the other major force here is that people are, I'd say it's a relatively well-known fact that people are cutting the cord as it relates to cable or satellite television. It doesn't mean that they're actually consuming less content. It just means that they have to find other places from which to find the content they're going to watch. And if you look at someone's, content consumption, there's probably a couple of categories there. Obviously, your SVOD services are significant there, but then at the same time, they're still looking for, in certain situations and certain occasions, a lean back experience, something where in many ways they're programmed too. They don't have to think so much about what they're watching. They can channel surf and flip a little bit to get there. And at the same time, they're not having to subscribe to another service for it. So in many ways, consumption obviously of content has gone up significantly, but at the same time, people aren't looking just to continually add new subscription services. So I think the FAST channel plays a really neat complementary role in that ecosystem of, well, I have subscription services, but I also want to check out what's on here on maybe it's a Thursday afternoon or a Saturday morning that isn't worth necessarily subscribing to. And FAST channels plays a really good role in that process.
Right, and certainly over the last year, people have had more time at home to just kind of poke around and see what's out there. I also think that, those of us in the industry, in the streaming industry, I think have been saying this for years, at first cutting the cord was seen as a cost saving effort, right? But I think all of us, and I shouldn't speak for anyone else on this panel, but a lot of us have always been saying, ultimately though, we predict that people are going to realize that they're paying as much or more for their video as they were before with cable. And so it's not really a surprise that these services have come into play. Anyone else want to chime in on the question about why we've seen this growth in the last year?
Yeah, I think that COVID has definitely acted as an accelerating factor, but I don't think this is going to be an isolated incident. It may have opened or prompted the behavior in some, but when the pandemic goes away, I don't believe we're going to see a sudden drop off. These are, new, ingrained, established habits that people are developing. And, if you remember back to the days of yore when you used to turn your, set-top box on and just channel surf for a while, that's really the niche that these fast channels are filling now. If you want to have something on in the background, maybe you used to throw on, Friends or The Office or, some other really well syndicated property, a lot of, popular fast channels, that's what they have the rights to, is these old popular series that you can just leave on for hours in the background. I think we'll all continue with that habit going forward.
I think to jump in there, and Eric, you brought up this point. I mean, Sling, as I mentioned, is a live subscription service, right? We're not fundamentally in the fast game as the primary focus. However, I think we realized with COVID, and even thinking before, that there are a lot of people in this ecosystem who want to cut the cord because of cost. And they are aware that you get Netflix and Hulu Prime and Disney Plus, and all of a sudden you're paying 80, 90, 100, then internet, then phone, and all of that. And I think what Sling made a decision to look at, and what a lot of, I think, fast offerings are looking at, is we want to give the flexibility for you to decide. Do you want that sort of premium content? Do you want that live sports on Sling or breaking news? Or is it really about, to Robert's point, is it about sitting back and putting on that background? Or is it about rewatching, Pluto has old Nickelodeon cartoons that I'm sure a lot of people have sat and watched, being stuck inside on Sunday mornings again. And so it's sort of become this thing where the focus is, I want to offer you what you want to watch. If you want to pay for the premium part, of course. But right now with COVID and everything going on, I think we're seeing just a dramatic increase in value prop in fast channels that would have probably happened, but certainly is accelerated. And I don't think it's slowing down by any stretch of the imagination.
Nick, did you want to chime in on that one, or?
Yeah, clearly, viewing hours have increased a lot as a result of the pandemic and people being at home. But I think we were seeing, huge usage and engagement in these fast channels before the pandemic came. As Robert and Andrew have mentioned, this very natural and relaxing way of viewing TV by channel surfing and leaving a virtual channel on for hours on end. That was already very well accepted with services like Pluto and Xumo, going back 3 or 4 years. So, this is a continuation of that, I think.
All right, well, let's look at the flip side of that question, really the mirror image. We've talked about what's happened in the last year. How do you think the fast channel universe is going to change in the year ahead?
I can jump in because I did see George's question, and I think it actually pertains. There's been a lot of revenue as well going into fast channels due to advertising. And because of that, there's been an additional explosion of fast channels. But when you look at, sort of feedback from the market, it's really always been a lot of the time content. And what we do see a bit of is as there are more fast channels coming in, there is the loss of the exclusive content, right? That's something that Pluto and Tubi and Redbox and a lot of these guys have to a degree because they now have big partners or big broadcasters associated with them. And so I do think we are going to see a quick saturation and then return to normal within the fast environment. I do expect over the next few years that a lot of these smaller guys who are trying to make it aren't going to be able to get the market share because that content already exists within a separate fast environment. And that's the biggest problem for incoming applications is what's different that I have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Andrew. The cliche is the cliche for a reason, right? Content is king. We're all going to be fighting over the same eyeballs, and it's whoever can provide the most engaging content, the most engaging experience, that's ultimately going to get those eyeballs. What your channel is able to deliver to your organization in terms of revenue is ultimately a function of, how many viewers can you get on it? And this came up earlier this week in the keynote panel where a lot of the traditional MVPD space has been very slow to adopt, the dynamic advertising, targeted advertising model. Whereas in this segment, that's the order of the day. That's all they do. So every ad that's shown is targeted and it's at that high CPM. So, it might not take as many subscribers as it otherwise would to sustain a channel in this space. On the flip side, I think we are going to see a lot of churn as, these channels boot up and maybe they have the rights to some interesting things and people start watching, but can you maintain that critical mass to keep the channel rolling, or do you seed way to the next new big channel?
Yeah, I agree with what Robert is saying there. I think what's interesting, and it's hard to predict who's going to necessarily survive and thrive or fail over the next couple of years, but you can definitely see the level of sophistication in fast channel programming is really increasing quickly. The technology and the cost to produce one and take one on is coming down pretty significantly. And I think, one of the things that we expect to see is, we expect that at some point, service providers like ours, like a Pluto, like a Xumo, at some point you can't just keep increasing indefinitely the number of channels that you have on a platform, because 2 reasons. One, it doesn't actually always increase the amount of people coming to the platform. It actually just splits it up into more and more smaller cuts. And then it actually affects discovery of the channels that are really successful. And so, there's going to be some inevitable rationalization, partly because they can't just get an aggregate viewership to continue operating a channel, but also service providers themselves. And we see this with other platforms. It's still early for us, but we see that other platforms are already undergoing that, I would say semi-regular culling process of what channels do they maintain on a FAST platform, and what they remove. And I think that's going to continue to evolve over time, and that's going to naturally create a kind of barrier for I suppose a less sophisticated or a lower quality brand partner that either struggles to drive viewership or watch time to remain relevant in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think the the future for a lot of these fast services is going to be their international rollout. So, maybe not so visible here in the US, but the same trends are taking place in other countries around the world of TV viewing and cord cutting, albeit at a more a less mature level than it is in the US. But I think all of these services are seeing their growth and their future revenue from globalizing what they've developed initially in the US.
So if you were launching a FAST channel right now, what sort of criteria do you think you would have to meet in order to get to the point where a FAST channel was launch worthy, so to speak?
I would think two things. One, you'd have to focus on the device relationships, right? I mean, you're not going to, that market in itself is so fragmented with the Roku, Amazon, Samsung, Vizio, Sony, right? And it's going to be really hard to get market share when you are only on one or two devices. So that's got to be one of the most important things. And the second is what's different, what's niche, right? I mean, you look at some of these apps today, like we noted, right? There is the Samsung Pluses, and there's the Plutos, and there's the Zumos, and there's Tubi, and they have a lot of content, and they share a lot of content too, which is important. Because if you're a small app, if you're just getting what they're getting, you're not really going to differentiate. No one's going to discover you. And so what can you do that's different? What can you do that's unique, right? A Doodle with just kids programming, a BritBox with British dramas in the US, right? Like those kind of things have a higher potential, even though they have a smaller audience, because you can build that sort of brand identity and people will go to you for that type of content instead of just Googling, where can I find Degrassi episodes?
Yeah, not to give away how we assess channels here at Redbox too deeply, but I think all those things make a ton of sense from Andrew, and some things that I think are really important. Obviously uniqueness is important, but it has to be more than just stitching together a bunch of digital shorts. There are some companies that do a really, really great job of that, and they're very thoughtful, curated. Jukin Media is a really successful business in that space, and they almost have programming as a consequence of their brands, like Fail Army or People Are Awesome, but they also curate it really, really well. I think we've already moved past that stage of find YouTube category that does well. License a bunch of content, aggregate it, and make it like the Uber gaming channel for fast channels. I mean, let's face it, the kids that watch that programming are watching it on YouTube. So you're not really going to migrate those folk to a lot of these platforms. Maybe there's standouts that you weren't expecting that maybe have a broader audience before that, but you have to think about what is the kind of programming that can have someone stop in a channel flip environment where you're one click away from a different channel, but then separately have programming that's meaningful enough that can last, for a session between 20 minutes and an hour. And anytime you're creating what I would call like opportunities to change channel, you're actually losing some of the momentum that you might be gaining. And digital shorts is one of those areas that I think, the more and more data that we see, it tells us that, it's less about that and more about long form television and film in the long term.
Chris mentioned YouTube, which I think is really important in this space, because as the technology provider on the panel, another thing other than the content is the the quality of the experience. Is your video clear? Is your audio clear? Is it, well leveled? With really great and easy to use consumer devices on the market now, user generated content is, high resolution. Audio is typically very well captured. And it makes it really easy to watch on YouTube. So if you're going over to your main screen and you're pulling down, a channel that has bad video quality, maybe there's transcoding artifacts, maybe the audio is all over the place, that difference in experience is something that a user is going to pick up. So aside from having the appropriate content and curation, you also need to have the right tech platform and make sure that the video you're delivering is actually something that somebody wants to watch.
We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A about how saturated the market is right now. And one of the questions that Jonathan had talked to you about was to ask, will the space eventually get too crowded? George Franklin in the Q&A mentioned Samsung has a free service for their new 4K and 8K users that has hundreds of linear channels. Are we already getting to the point where we're seeing oversaturation? Are we not there yet? Where do you think we are on that timeline?
I mean, a lot of those channels are, provided by existing back-end, channel aggregators like Pluto and Zumo. They're not necessarily originating all of them themselves, so there's going to be some overlap there. I think the best analog we can draw is that, we've got Netflix, we've got Peacock, we've got Hulu, we've got Disney Plus. So there's all these premium content services out there, and they're all doing, really well, despite there being, a half a dozen to a dozen of them that I can name off the top of my head. I think as long as these FAST platforms can match that level of unique content, you're not at your oversaturated point. You can, on any given day, you can open up Netflix or you can open up Disney and watch something different. And as long as that remains the case in the FAST arena, we're not to the point where there's too many yet.
Yeah, I think, what's still missing from the FAST ecosystem, and, that's going to change this year, is, really big brands, really popular, like HBO, like NBC, and maybe others who are going to launch free ad-supported tiers of their existing paid services. And I think that's, that's going to be quite disruptive, because as that content and the brand association and the very well-known and premium level content starts getting distributed through FAST channels, that's definitely going to change things, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Nick's saying there. I mean, we haven't seen the proliferation of, quote unquote, traditional networks come to FAST channels, at least with their network brands and network programming. Now, by the way, many of them never will. So, it's not like you're going to have this instant migration, or at some point migration of everything that's there is going to come to a FAST channel environment. It's just, it's a completely different economic model, and it won't make sense for many of them. But I do think that that quote unquote wave is likely to come in some shape or form. I don't, it's hard to say if there's ever going to be a true oversaturation of channels. I think the level of competition will go up. There's still, at least in my opinion, a ton of demand yet to be seen on these platforms. It's still going to keep growing, and it'll probably grow for the next, between, maybe it's 3 to 5 years in reality. And so, as long as there is more demand for these services, you're going to see competition for those channels to essentially get the placement and the real estate on the major FAST channel platforms. So I don't know if I could ever call it oversaturation so much as increased competition, and perhaps the bar for an acceptable channel is going to go up. Stringing together 40 old episodes of X may work really great today. Maybe 12 months from today, it won't. And I think that's more likely, at least in my opinion, to be the outcome of increased competition, is just the quality and the requirements. It's just going to keep going up.
To jump in there, exactly what Chris said. I mean, that was Sling's viewpoint, right? Which is, hey, we've always had this live service and you have to pay for the service. It's $35 a month. You have to pay for it, but not everyone wants that, right? And someone asked a comment about, I think, watching Baywatch versus HBO Max or something along that. And I think that's true. There are some people who would just prefer that free channel and don't care about Raising Wolves or what that show was. And I think the smart broadcasters, while a lot of them won't do it, will see that opportunity and realize that, we don't have to put everything above the paywall, but it may be worth putting a few things. I also think, I disagree a little bit with Robert and Chris in the sense that I do think it's a little bit saturated already, but I'm also biased because now I have to search through 50 apps to get my content. But, Netflix and Disney, they are different content. What I do think is going to happen is the saturation isn't going to stop, but I think apps are going to get a lot smarter with it. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is you look at apps like FilmRise or FailArmy, right? These are people who have their own apps, but also share their content within Sling or within Pluto or within Tubi. And what it's allowed them to do, and it's been really sophisticated, is they'll say, I don't care where you watch my content. I just want you to watch it. And we know as long as we're involved in these apps, as long as our inventory is available, people are going to drive to it. But siloing yourself to one app can be really dangerous in the FAST environment because you just may not be found when there are hundreds of similar apps. And so I expect, or my guess in the next 3 to 5 years, is that approach. Hey, how can I get my content on as many places as possible?
Right. And I think you've all hit on something key, and that's in response to that question about why would someone choose Baywatch on a FAST channel when they've got WandaVision on Disney Plus. And that's because it's not really an either or question, right? And there are different times that you as a viewer want different things, or within a given household, people have different preferences. I come out and find my wife she's constantly watching the Severe channel on the LG FAST service. I almost never do that. I'm almost always going to go to something on demand. Each viewer has their own preferences, and each viewer has different preferences at different times of the day. Andrew, you mentioned earlier how important it was for FAST channels to have relationships with device manufacturers. As you look at the device ecosystem, is there a type of device or platform that is winning the race, or what are the pros and cons of different types of devices, say Roku versus smart TV? And Nick, I'll throw that to you right away because you're with a TV manufacturer.
Yeah, so clearly the platform has to be capable and able to deliver a quality experience. And smart TVs today have evolved a long way from the smart TVs we originally launched back in 2007 with improved codecs and QoS and more sophisticated user interfaces and operating systems, all the things that the streaming media conferences cover every year. So clearly those are table stakes. You have to have those basic capabilities, otherwise people just switch off, or they lose patience with their smart TV and go and buy a stick and plug that into it. So you've got to make sure that those basic performance parameters are there. And then you've got to have a well curated selection of apps. You've got to have all the apps that people expect to be there. And if there's just one app that the customer wants and it's not there, they're going to complain like hell about it, and rightly so.
Other thoughts on that question, or?
Nick's correct. I mean, Roku obviously is probably still in first, right? They were the first ones in the ecosystem, but you look at what Samsung's trying to do, and they're now bringing that kind of content to their live TVs, and every single TV is going to start having an operating system. And so, it'll be interesting to see what Roku does in response to that. They've obviously released their own TVs, but, some brand loyalty because Nick is on this call, I will say I only buy Sony TVs, right? And, I have streaming devices plugged in. Well, I need that the next time I buy a Sony TV, and I think that's really going to be what the next 5 years will be really interesting to see, because we are at a point right now where you take the percentages of, Roku users, Amazon users, Samsung users, it looks like the MVPD marketplace, right? Who has BIOS? Who has RCN? And who has, all of these? Who has Spectrum? And is that the future? Probably. Actually, absolutely. So that will be a really interesting next 5 years to watch the device war, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I'll just add just a little to that. The device manufacturers play a increasingly outsized role in the ecosystem for and this, frankly, at Redbox, people like, Nick and Sony, or, competitors and CE manufacturers, or streaming sticks, they're very important to us. Historically, Redbox as a business was focused on, the customer first, but then studios and retailers second. Well, the retailer in that analog is a CE manufacturer for our app as much as a streaming channel. So, we can and should devote as much time as we need. And I'd like to think that we're a relatively large business that can hold our own in a lot of environments. We still need to make sure that we're thoughtful about those interactions. The fast channel ecosystem, outside of the web, which frankly is a fractional amount of consumption for fast channels, it's not an open environment. You can't just create a fast channel, distribute it to 6 different devices, and suddenly you've got yourself a large, footprint. You have to make sure that you take care of the partners that can essentially help you reach the consumers you're trying to reach. And frankly, that's OEMs, and then other partners like Redbox, and beyond that. But at the same time, we spend a lot of time with our OEM partners because they are so important to the future of the business.
Very good, and welcome, Jonathan. Glad you could join us today. We have discussed the past year in the fast channel ecosystem, what we think the next year is going to look like, devices, what makes for a successful brand. I was just about to jump into discussions about revenues using your questions, which I appreciate you providing. Do you have any thoughts on the device question, though, that perhaps Nick or Chris haven't answered?
I think I agree with everything that they've said, but looking at it from the other side of the coin, meaning the Best Ever Channels is launching channels on as many devices as possible. And as everyone has said, this is we're sort of midway through this phase of what fast channels are. And I think from a content provider standpoint, from a channel provider standpoint, what you want to do is get on as many devices as possible, basically to hedge your bets, but also to reach the widest audience possible. So even if you're a niche content category, you're going to have people that are using a Sony TV set versus are using a Sling device versus, just brought their Samsung home and turned it on and, oh, look, there's a channel I didn't even know existed before. And so the farther and wider you can go, basically the greater the discovery will be as these devices sort of, as the consumer decides what devices they're going to use or not, and maybe some will fall away. If you're as wide as possible, then you'll definitely be on the ones that are being used. So, just from the content owner's perspective, I would say the bigger you can spread your, your channel, the bigger the universe you can spread your channel to, the better.
Okay, before we jump into the revenue discussion, actually, there is a question in the Q&A that addresses content and programming. And Evan Roberts is asking, what do you think the future is going to be for local programming within these sort of globalized fast channels? Is there a place for local programming there?
Yeah, I think it's huge because you can now watch, you can be living in San Diego and watch the, Washington, DC, local news feed. And, if you're an expat from somebody else around the country or indeed around the world, you can now have a choice of watching all that local programming from where you come from, rather than where you live. And you know, it hasn't really been possible to do that with you know, the way cable arranges its channels. So yeah, that's really big.
Also, you know, as virtual MVPD, we would love access to local channels, because really it's live sports. We forget how many viewers, because the NFL is a little bit different, but the MLB, the NHL, the NBA, that is one of the big reasons a lot of people still have cable, because of blackout restrictions. And it will be fascinating to watch, you know, how does local start, especially local sports, start to move into the OTT environment, and do they, or is that one of the last things kind of hanging that thread? Or I shouldn't say one of the last things, but one of the more important things hanging the MVPD thread. And so I personally think that is going to be some, if not the most interesting story to watch develop over the 2 to 3 years, because there's a lot of pluses, but a lot of minuses for those broadcasters to make that inventory so easily accessible. And I'm not sure whether they will or won't.
When you have Stir already in the local, you know, providing local broadcasting feeds to individuals in different areas based on that broadcasting feed, I think the you know, the real question is, how will the retransmission laws translate into this universe, and how will that affect, you know, who pays for what rights in order to do those local broadcasts? But you know, local has always been appealing.
Yeah, I just want to add, you know, local is a really interesting area for us at Redbox, but then also I think for the industry at large, for a couple of reasons. I think sports is always going to be tricky, but if you can get them on local, that would be amazing on a fast channel on local. But also the news is local. There's a genuine connection between, you know, local newscasters or even frankly like the weatherman or the weather women on local, frankly, because, you know, they're there in the town that you're living as well. And we believe really strongly in local. We believe strongly in local and live, frankly, as being interesting areas to grow. Part of the reason that perhaps you haven't seen as much of it on these platforms, Jonathan points out, Stir does quite a lot by virtue of the fact that it's a Sinclair organization. I think part of it is, one, that those local businesses have historically been focused on their retrans deals with MVPDs, and they're going to continue doing that as long as there is a significant, you know, economic justification for that. But then at the same time, it's a rights and technology issue that they're catching up with. What I do think is going to be a challenge increasingly in that area, because I love the concept for our business, it's actually a discovery problem. If I could get 500 local channels on my platform, how the hell do I make them all fit into a UI that is compelling for a customer without just giving them too much? My head of content partnerships, Laura Florence, she's constantly finding really great angles around, you know, how we could bring local partners in, and you know, it's something that we're actively looking at. I think it's an area that's yet to be fully realized, but I personally really excited about it. And I also think, by the way, that one last thing, on the programmatic advertising side, local actually has a significant opportunity beyond national. And so that can't be forgotten in all of this conversation.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's a good launching off point to talk about revenue. Can you talk just in general about what the revenue opportunities might be for, I think, Jonathan, you called it a mid-range fast channel. Jonathan, how do you define a mid-range fast channel? And then we can go around the horn and talk about revenue opportunities. And then there's some questions in the Q&A that relate specifically to revenue.
Well, I think mid-range depends on the platform, right? I mean, if you have 30 million potential monthly average uniques, then mid-range would be 15 million is the universe you're pulling from. But, you know, no fast channel is probably pulling 15 million monthly average uniques in and of itself. If it is, then it's probably launching its own platform soon. You know, and that would be, yeah, that would be tremendous. Typically, I think a fast channel probably pulls in, if it's pulling in 1 million or 2 monthly average uniques with a couple of hours of view time each, then I think that the channel's probably in that mid-range doing well category. And then the rest is math, right? And it depends again on the platform, but advertisers generally will pay, say, a $12 to $15 CPM, maybe $20 if you can really integrate them in, and it's a really targeted audience. And you know, how many ads can you fit in an hour? Is it 3? Is it 6? Is it 12? You know, that again depends on the platform. But you can just start doing the math and see that the numbers can work out pretty well, especially if you're across multiple platforms. You know, 30 million with this one, 20 million with that one, 10 million with the other. Now you're in over 50 million homes right there. So one of the things I think that people need to know is the economy of scales with fast channels is much better for the independent channel than it would be otherwise. So if I have 1 million viewers on, you know, best classics ever, and I go out and I'm trying to sell that even to the AARP or somebody who's perfectly targeted for that audience, the agency is going to look at me and go, really, I'm going to buy 1 million impressions at a time, you know, or maybe it's 10 million impressions with those 1 million people. Whereas, you know, Pluto can go out and sell their entire inventory against that same ad buy. They can go sell 100 million impressions, of which 10 million are mine. So it makes it easier for the advertising monetization to happen for individual channels when they're in a, you know, a collection of multiple ad channels.
Which is, you know, which is what I brought up earlier exactly, which is if you're mid-tail, what the smart move to do is to get on not only as many devices, but as many, you know, fast providers as possible. That's really how you're going to maximize scale. There's the added benefit too. Like if you look at the programmatic ecosystem, if you have viewers who are coming in once a month for 30 minutes, that's really hard to monetize. But if you're monetizing that channel on like a Pluto who has a consistent user base, it's going to be a lot easier for DSPs and DMPs and third-party data providers to see that user and know immediately who needs to be buying them. And so I think that's something that really also is considered when you look at mid-tier, is that approach to the market, because that will make all the difference for media buyers as well.
Yeah, everybody has a digital thumbprint these days. You know, I've been in ad tech almost my entire tenure in telecom, and the technology has only gotten, you know, more and more pervasive as we've been able to track people cross-platform and keep track of them via, you know, anonymized IDs. I can throw out some pretty specific figures that were, you know, quoted quite heavily at in one of my immediate previous lives at an ad tech provider. If you've got really good information on a subscriber, and that's, you know, email address, that's maybe Facebook, that's, you know, maybe physical address, household addressable, you can see a CPM of up to $40. Individual addressable, you can see a CPM of up to $50. You know, these are the extreme high end when you have that really deep granularity available on these subscribers. Ultimately, what that translates into is, okay, you've got an ad load of say 8 to 10 minutes per hour on your channel, which tends to be, you know, a bit lower than your MVPD average. So you're making between 60 cents and $1 for every hour that, you know, one of your high value subscribers is looking at your channel. That's a pretty great calculus compared to, we would typically say $20 to $25, you know, CPM equivalent for an MVPD scheduled ad slot. You know, it's pretty easy to see that if you've got detailed information on your subscribers, it's really easy to turn that into dollars.
Nick,
yeah,
does that jive with what you're saying as well?
I'm sorry, Eric.
Is that do the figures that Rob just shared and earlier the figures that Jonathan mentioned, does that sort of jive with what you're seeing?
It does. Yeah, it does. They're good now. Now the challenge is to, you know, when you hear the numbers that Robert would put out there, I don't want to say eye popping, but $40 to $50 is really, really high. It's not in the fast channel world possible, definitely possible. For a new entrant or someone who doesn't have a sophisticated platform, or perhaps the channel supplying a channel to a platform that isn't capturing those sorts of things, you're probably not looking at those levels. But absolutely, that's in the range. I think, and I think also, by the way, that the numbers that you can generate on a CPM basis, it continues to go up. You know, the cable television business is a $70 billion advertising funded business today. You know, those dollars aren't going to evaporate entirely. So, you know, if someone's looking at their own FAST channel, and they're like, look, I'm getting $10 CPMs today, or $5 to $10, you know, that number isn't going to stay indefinitely at that range. I think you're seeing increasing demand for you know, FAST channel content, or just generally OTT content with programmatic ads, and that's going to raise the level of both, frankly, the CPM and the fill rate along the way.
We have a couple of questions that refer back to things that a number of us have said throughout the course of the last 45 minutes, that there are some people who will use FAST channels as background, as the come home, turn on the TV. Doesn't that devalue the CPM?
Yeah, I mean, simple answer is yes. One of the hot topics in the ad tech space has been tracking actual engagement with the content. You know, if you use a Netflix interface, for instance, and you just let it roll, you know, after 2 or 3 episodes, it eventually comes up and says, "Are you still watching?" And you could easily extrapolate that out in a FAST environment, where you might get a prompt from your interface, and it asks you, you know, "Are you watching?" And maybe it only stays up there for a minute or two, and it continues to play the content regardless of whether you interact with it or not. But a sophisticated ad backend would be able to take that into account and adjust, you know, the value of that set of eyeballs that's consuming the ad inventory accordingly.
I think you could argue that the current cable and television standards also do not account for the fact that somebody's going to the bathroom during commercials, or somebody's, you know, attention span. So I think if, as Robert says, the sophistication of the technology gets to the point where it's clear, you know, this is a better environment than that is, that will affect things. But in the shorter run, you know, I think there's a tolerance for that delta of who's actually watching and who isn't.
I also think you see a lot of focus on content, right? I mean, I think content still matters when you try to extrapolate that out when you don't have the data necessarily, right? I mean, a live NFL football game is always going to be, regardless of whether that user may be focusing away or go to the bathroom during the break, more expensive and inherently of higher interest than, I'm sorry if anyone's a Baywatcher, it just comes to my mind because of that question, and if you're watching Baywatch, right? And I think where ad tech still needs to develop is how do we prove out ROI in OTT? There are a lot of partners doing it. The ROI and the return on ad spend is really strong, but it's not at the sophisticated level that you may be able to do with display and some of the more sophisticated NTA tools. So I think we have a way to go. I think, you know, the market in general has a way to go, but you start to see sort of some semblance of how it's going to work, which is the content being a huge focal point when looking at, you know, devaluing inventory because someone may not be watching as much.
Speaking of the content and speaking of figuring out who's watching the content, can you talk about the analytics that various FAST platforms are providing back to content owners? How uniform are those analytics? How close to the vest do they prefer to keep that data? That's a question from Mike Green in the audience. Anyone want to take that first?
Nope.
Nobody wants to take that.
I can tell you as the technology provider who potentially wants to consume that information, that it's never as much as we want. You know, I would love to get my hands on detailed viewership information, but it's not out there, and I completely understand why.
It's not uniform either. So, you know, there's a huge opportunity for somebody to, to get in there with technology that can make it uniform or that can create a dashboard that combines everything together. And there's people doing that and trying to do that. But, you know, ultimately it depends on what the platform is willing to provide. So I would say, you know, if you've got a fast channel or a bevy of fast channels that are really succeeding on other people's platforms, ultimately creating your own platform so you can control that data yourself, and that user is the holy grail. It's just a matter of getting to that point.
Yeah, it's you know, it's a tricky topic, because as a platform that we are, obviously we, you know, like every other platform or service provider, holds that data, you know, pretty closely to the chest. There are, you know, for us, you know, we do think about things, you know, if you're talking about like what are metrics that are interesting to us. MAUs is interesting to us. Aggregate hours watched or hours per session are interesting metrics. They matter to us a lot. Return frequency is an important metric, you know, and I think with our fast channel providers that we work with, there's a fair amount of information analytics today that they can actually glean, at least for channels that they're powering with their own technology. So in many cases, they're working with someone like a Zumo, a Magi, or Whirl. By the way, we work with all of those guys. They're actually powering the channel, and in many ways, we're providing the connection, input, and output to the customer. They can see a ton from actually powering the channel. There are things that we won't share on a platform level basis, but at the same time, there's a decent amount of information that they can frankly find out from operating the channel. I think where part of it is, I think sometimes you have to separate the proprietary nature of the data and someone's unwillingness to share it, which I'm not going to lie, happens more than once, not just with Redbox, but with lots of partners. Then there's also, frankly, just the state of the industry, right? Like analytics always comes late. You know, when everyone's building at 1,000,000 miles an hour, you know, thinking about an external developer portal is the thing that if you have to cut something off and still go live in the month you planned, that's the first thing to go. So it's sometimes we have to separate the unwillingness to share with potentially, frankly, the maturity of the platform, the sophistication of what they can offer the content partners.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left. So I've got one last question. And thank you again to Jonathan for providing the questions in advance, so that if there were technical difficulties that prevented you from joining, I was able to step in. So it's been great. What do you think is next for fast channels or for the larger OTT ecosystem? Is it VR, perhaps AR in ads? Another type of platform? You know, we saw broadcast evolve from cable to digital, and then on demand to streaming. As you look ahead, what do you see coming next? And again, I'm going to go around the room, starting with my upper left. So starting with Chris.
Oh, gee. Okay. So you know, it's a really good question, Eric. And I'm sure as I hear everyone else speak, I'll probably change what I'm going to say. I think I don't think VR and AR are necessarily fundamental to the fast channel ecosystem. You know, for me, when I think about what makes a fast channel service interesting, or a fast channel provider interesting, it's something that's it's going to do one of two things. It's going to have me lean in and really, really watch that content from a position of focus, and that's more like live sports, live news, events, things that make me just have to sit forward in my chair. Second one is and frankly more predominant, is lean back, which is just good bingeable content that I could watch for 6 hours, frankly, walk away from for a while, and come back. Like well, maybe not Baywatch, maybe, but CSI, for instance, right? You know, those kinds of experiences are really interesting. And I only bring that up because I think that doesn't lend itself to VR or AR. So, you know, or at least I can't think of a use case where that will work for the programming. And by the way, the programming is generally at least more than 5 to 10 years old, which means it wasn't built with those kinds of tech in mind. I do think what's going to be happening over the next couple of years is you're going to see a increasing influx of larger brands. Single series programming seeming to work on lots of platforms, and I think that's an interesting area to look at. But one of the reasons I think that's interesting is actually not that it's necessarily that people only want to watch one channel. It's that it's a simplified discovery mechanism for watching content. If you're in a world of 200 plus channels, you're just like, oh, it's all Baywatch all day. I don't have to worry about tuning in at 4. And I think that's an interesting thing that we're going to see in increasing levels. The last thing that I'm curious to see if this happens, and I think it will, probably more so with CE manufacturers in many ways, is the intermingling of fast platforms with paid services. Right now, they're pretty distinct. Right now, it's, and even on Redbox, it is relatively distinct, and we're always looking at how to build a better ecosystem. X channels, here that are free combined with maybe potentially paid channels as well, be it SVOD or linear, not unlike replacing a cable system, but just, again, trying to solve for this fragmentation of access and improved discovery of, I want this channel now, and maybe I want to pop down to something I paid for. I think that's an interesting area that I haven't seen anyone do massively well yet, but I think is an opportunity there.
Great. Rob, what about you?
I have two thoughts in this space. One is in the consumer experience and the other is in the back end. So from the consumer experience side, I see us moving more toward a personalized model. So already with the dynamic ad insertion, we're delivering ads that are specifically targeted to you based on who we see you being and what you're likely to consume. There's no reason we can't use that same technology for the content itself. If I have a profile of you, Eric, as someone that likes this specific set of content and has watched specific programs in the past, using AI or machine learning, similar to what like a Spotify experience might be, or even a YouTube experience might be, I can, with some degree of accuracy, predict what you might like to watch next, pick a default, and maybe give you a couple choices there. And then the channel ceases to become about what I as the programmer am dictating to you, but more what you as the user are choosing to some level of choice choosing to consume. Sort of like a hybrid linear VOD experience where if you don't interact with it, it's just going to pick something that it thinks you want to watch and show that to you next. But like YouTube, you could mouse over or remote over and pick the next thing that you want to watch. On the opposite side, on the back end, I think we're going to see a lot of advances in ad technology. I think those are even happening right now on different platforms. Facebook is scarily accurate when it comes to what ads that it shows you. And we all know that the video arena is extremely conservative when it comes to what technology it's rolling out. So in the coming years, I think we'll start to see adoption of that same level of ad tracking and ad targeting to people consuming video content. Which is really, as we kind of touched on earlier, what's necessary to see those higher level CPMs. So it's going to be revenue driven.
All right, Jonathan.
I think it's tech for sure that's going to shift and change. I think the only reason why there isn't a more sophisticated programming guide that crosses all platforms and boundaries today is because it doesn't make business sense to a lot of the people that own the gateways to making that happen. But as consumers get more and more sophisticated in their tastes and their desires in terms of the programming, I think that maybe those gateways will open a little bit. So that's why you have the Baywatch channel 24/7 today, is because it's one of the easier technological ways to make it available to a consumer when they want it. But I think technology can do much better than that, and that's probably inevitable.
Perfect. Nick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so yeah, I won't echo everything that everyone else has said, but just looking from a device manufacturer's perspective, we're trying to do that Uber user interface, if you like, that brings in the fast channels from all of the different fast apps. So we're putting those fast channels into the Sony EPG inside the TV. So you press the guide button on your remote control, and you'll see channels from Zumo and Pluto and Redbox and Haystack and many others, all in a traditional grid guide. So that's where we are currently on trying to help with that navigation. And then I saw the question from somebody on the Q&A about hyper targeting, and I think the answer is yes. It's really only the TV that knows what channels are being watched from fast services, what channels are being watched from the tuner or from the HDMI input. And, that gives a much more holistic picture of who the customer is and what they like.
Terrific. And Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everyone, what everyone said. I think, looking at it from maybe a different lens, which is the advertising. We're still in the traditional, hey, it's 2 minutes per pod, or it's just 30 seconds at the beginning. And I think smart publishers or smart programmers, smart applications are going to figure out new ways to grow that revenue that might remove sort of the traditional 30-second, 15-second creative, whether it's more sponsorships, whether it's, being able to pause, see what someone's wearing and buy that coat, whatever it may be. I do think we are going to see a growth of new avenues because, you have that potential, and it's one of the quickest ways to differentiate yourself is improve the user experience through different advertising solutions.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. This has been a terrific discussion. Thanks again to Jonathan for preparing such terrific questions. Glad you could join us for the second half of the discussion. I know these things happen, and we were just glad to see you. So I'd also like to thank Harmonic for sponsoring this panel, and Limelight Networks for sponsoring this entire week of Streaming Media Connect. We are back in about 25 minutes with that discussion about what OTT might look like in 2025. So I hope to see you then.